In the 1840s, a four-time failure at the Chinese imperial examinations claimed to have received a commission from the Heavenly Father of all mankind to drive the foreign barbarians known as Manchus out of China, form an indigenous Chinese dynasty in their place, destroy all idols, and establish the worship of the one true God throughout China. They collected thousands of followers and gained vital battle experience in ethnic feuding with neighboring Yao people. As tensions came to a head with local authorities, and the now 20,000-strong God-worshipping society arrives on the cusp of breaking out onto the stage as a major player, engulfing China in the fires of violent upheaval, as other anti-Manchu groups seize the opportunity to overthrow the hated Manchu regime. You might well be wondering to yourself, what the heck is a Manchu? I promised in episode 1 introducing China that I'd talk more about the 8 banners when we reached the 1850s, and here we are. The 8 banners as an institution was practically unique in history, and it's so different from many institutions in the West that it's hard to give an analogy of what it was like. It was sort of like if you combined the Knights Templar with the caste system of India and a modern charity organization. It was a socio-economic military organization that had 2 reasons for existing. First, to cultivate a loyal support base for the ruling dynasty from which soldiers and administrators could be recruited. And second, to provide a social security net for that support base to keep them loyal. The 8 banners had its origins in the late 16th century as the disparate Jurchen tribes beyond the northeastern frontier of China were coalescing into the Manchu state. They called it the later Qing Dynasty, a name which harkened back to the 12th to 13th century Qin, the Jurchen-led dynasty which was ruling over North China when the Mongol hordes invaded. This Qing dynasty is not to be confused with the Qing dynasty that ruled China in the 3rd to 5th centuries. We can't answer the question of what the 8 banners was without first asking another question. What exactly is a Jurchen or Manchu? This has been the subject of a fairly heated debate for several hundred years. I can't possibly set the record straight in this short video, but I do of course have my own favorite theory which I'm totally qualified to rate higher than all the others. The Jurchens were a group of culturally and linguistically related tribes that lived in a region now divided between northeastern China, that part of China east of Mongolia and north of Korea, and the Russian Far East, that part of Russia just northeast of Korea. Manchuria, as it's called in the West, is a heavily forested, mountainous region. Jurchen tribes were semi-nomadic, making a living from horseback off a mixture of hunting, animal husbandry, and farming. There was no centralized authority over them, except during the times of the Qing Dynasty, and so they had no collective identity. It should be mentioned here that some scholars do dispute that the Qing Dynasty was ruled by people that had any relation to the Jurchens. The Chinese certainly saw the Jurchens as the descendants of the Jin, and the Jurchens agreed. But the only connection modern scholarship can find is that they spoke virtually the same language. Language, however, doesn't prove genetic or even cultural heritage. Be that as it may, things began to change in the late 16th century, when Nurhaci, leader of the Asingiro clan, started bringing the other tribes under his control. The later 16th and early 17th centuries was a turbulent time in Manchuria. Jurchen, Mongol, and Jurchenized Mongol tribes were fighting it out for supremacy, while Korea and China jumped in to stir things up when opportunity presented itself. The Jurchens, who were already a martial people, were fast becoming a full-blown warrior culture, and this is the origin of the 8 banners. The people of Nurhaci's Qing Dynasty were organized into a military structure consisting of 4 groups, or banners, which were further divided into smaller subgroups. The 4 banners were later expanded into 8. The banners included not just men who were in active service, but also reserves, potential recruits, and their families. Men from the same company served together on campaign and in garrison duty. Companies and other units within the system had officers appointed from among their own number. These positions were often quasi-hereditary, but the emperor reserved the right to assign them as he saw fit. This system created a highly organized and very effective military force. It was also very loyal, which was the critical point of all of this. Nurhaci's domain was stitched together from many old tribal territories and included Jurchens, Mongols, Koreans, and Han. All these people had their own loyalties, but Nurhaci needed to unify them and make them loyal to him. The idea was that the Jurchens were all one nation. They spoke more or less the same language, shared more or less the same culture, way of life, spiritual beliefs, and a common heritage. It was an early form of nationalism that he used to bind the disparate tribes together. Mongols, while not Jurchens, were brought into the fold since they were very similar, and Han and Koreans who lived alongside them within the Jin state were allowed to come along because Nurhaci needed everyone on board to, as I said, unify the state under his rule. He also needed all the support he could get if he was to stand up to his much more powerful neighbor, Qing Dynasty China. An important milestone in the creation of a unified identity for Jurchens was when they adopted a new name, Manchu. A quick side note, it's actually pronounced more like Manchu, but I'll stick with the more familiar Manchu. Surprisingly enough, we actually know the exact date when Manchu started being used as the name for these people, even though we don't know what it actually means. It was in November 1635 that Hong Taichi, son of Nurhaci, issued a proclamation stating that Manchu was the proper ancient name for the Jurchen people, and therefore Jurchen should never be used again, and was in fact made illegal. Whether or not this was actually true wasn't important. What was important was that, bound together under the 8-banner system, and given a new name, the identity of Manchus became inextricably linked to the banner system. In the next year, 1636, the later Qin was renamed the Great Qing, tying the Manchu identity to that of the empire as well. In 1644, the Banner Army was the leading force that conquered North China, at which point Beijing became the capital, and also became the new home of the Manchu people. While Manchu people would, of course, continue to live in Manchuria, Beijing would come to be home to half of the banner population of the empire. The other aspect of the 8 banners as an institution, and the half that makes this system unique, is the socio-economic aspect of it. As mentioned, soldiers in active service were not the only members of their respective units. These military units also included the dependents of those soldiers. Although these people didn't serve in battle or do garrison duties, they were not considered to be civilians. As part of the banner system, they had certain privileges and responsibilities. They were subject to the military courts of the Banner Army, and were also subject to certain regulations on how they lived their lives, enforced by the officers of the unit they were part of. In return for their loyal service, the emperors were obligated to make sure the banner people were looked after. To this end, the banner stipends were instituted shortly after the conquest. Stipends were regular payments of silver and food made to every banner household in the empire. They were also guaranteed housing, and emperors often scrounged up funds to pay off the debts owed by banner people. Debt would become more and more of an issue later on, as after the conquest, banner people were also banned from getting a job outside of the army or the civil bureaucracy. Theoretically, every household should have at least one member who had a job, bringing in an income on top of their stipend. But with the population boom, combined with an economic downturn in the 18th century, there just weren't enough positions available for everyone, which meant that quite a few households were left without a breadwinner. This didn't stop them from living extravagant lives, however. They were banner people after all. They couldn't be expected to live like ordinary schmucks. They borrowed heavily to sustain this standard of living, knowing the emperor would pay it all off for them in a few years. This created a bit of a problem. As you might imagine, growing up as the pampered favorites of the imperial court, receiving regular handouts, and having all debts paid off every so often, is not exactly the prime environment for the fostering of diligence. Major wars were few for the Qing. There were the three feudatory and White Lotus rebellions, but these were generations apart, and the end of the White Lotus rebellion was decades before the First Opium War. Maintaining a state of military readiness generation after generation was tiresome. What was the point when there seemed to be no enemy in the entire world that could possibly challenge the might of the great Qing? Scholarly disagreement arises mainly from questions of whether or not the rising Manchu identity can be considered to have been ethnic in nature, in the modern sense of ethnicity. How much of that sense of identity was rooted in the genetic heritage of the individual in question, and to what degree Manchus eventually assimilated into local Chinese culture. The next 2 centuries would be marked by a near-constant effort on the part of the imperial court to reinforce what it considered to be the core values of Manchuness, summed up in the oft-repeated refrain, "Riding, shooting, and speaking Manchu." A Manchu man must, the court insisted, be able to shoot a bow from foot and horseback, be able to ride a horse competently, and speak Manchu fluently. There were other qualities as well, such as frugality. Settling into their comfortable lives in Beijing, Manchus had found they had a taste for the high life of the Chinese upper class. Other Manchus were placed in garrison cities all over the empire, some numbering a few hundred, others in the thousands. Despite the fact that there was a literal wall of separation between them and the Chinese population of the cities they inhabited, they seemed to be losing sight of what had made the Manchus great. Segregation of Banner and Chinese populations was instituted even before the conquest, partially to prevent this sort of thing from happening. But so far from the forests and rivers of their ancestral homeland, the way of life of their ancestors was quickly fading away. As the last vestiges of Ming holdouts in the south were brought under control, the martial ways of the past gave way to a sedentary, scholarly existence that seemed alarmingly like the way of life for the Chinese. That was fine for the Chinese, but Manchus were a different breed. Without the pressing need for a state of readiness, practicing shooting and riding became pointless and boring, and being surrounded by a sea of Chinese people meant they had little use for the Manchu language. Although the court continued to issue documents in Manchu as well as Chinese, most Manchus seem to have largely forgotten their own language within 2 or 3 generations of the conquest. But how much of this was actually the case? How much a part of the cultural identity of the Jurchens of old had riding, shooting, and speaking Manchu been? Was Nordhachi really the frugal paragon of Manchu ideals later Qing rulers made him out to be? Did the Manchus really assimilate so deeply into Chinese culture that they became all but indistinguishable from the people among whom they lived? These are the sorts of questions scholars have been arguing over. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, popular opinion had it that the Manchus, after settling in China, effectively became Chinese. They took on Chinese titles. They took up the Chinese examination system. They became the champions of Confucianism. They wore Chinese clothes. This view of the Sinicization of the Manchus has, amusingly, allowed them to simultaneously occupy the positions of foreign imperialist oppressors and the victims of foreign imperialist oppression in the minds of Chinese nationalists like Sun Yat-sen. But if this was the case, why did Hung Xiuquan and many others like him see the Manchus as foreigners? If they were indistinguishable from Chinese, what made them foreign? More recent scholarship has taken a nuanced view. The Qing rulers were all things to all people so as to maximize their legitimacy in the eyes of all the subjects of their multi-ethnic empire. To the Chinese, they were the sons of heaven. To the Mongols, they were the legal successors of Genghis Khan. as they possessed the imperial seals of the Mongol-led Qing Dynasty, which they got from the Chahar Mongols, whom Nurhaci subdued in the early 17th century. To Manchus, the emperor was a more familiar fatherly figure. Many officials in the Banner administration and civil bureaucracy wrote regular memorandums to the emperor, appraising him of the situation within their jurisdiction, often asking questions about decisions they had to make. Manchu officials shared far more intimate correspondence than non-Manchus. Emperors even used surprisingly intimate terms like us Manchus, putting Manchu officials in the same category as themselves, albeit not as equals, but in the same category nonetheless. Scholars are still divided, however, over when Manchus really became an ethnicity as such. Many people seem to have misconceptions about what an ethnicity is, so I'll define it here so we're all on the same page. While things like race and language are largely objective concepts based on factors outside the individual, ethnicity is very subjective. It's the result of a complicated relationship between practically everything humans use to distinguish themselves from others. Language, dialect, culture, traditions, folklore, religion, history, genetic heritage, and more. Think of the three main ethnicities of the former Union of Yugoslavia: Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks. They share a language and have much of the same culture and history, and they're all South Slavs. Yet, despite having more similarities than differences, they're separate ethnicities that are supposed to be diametrically opposed to one another. In short, ethnicity is more about self-identification and group acceptance than anything else. What group do you identify with? And are you accepted within that group? Some argue that the Manchus didn't develop this kind of group identification until well into the 18th century, with the zeal of the Qianlong Emperor to bring back the old ways of the Manchus, or at least his vision of the old ways, and in so doing creating a new ethnic identity. Others argue that the establishment of the 8 banners and of the Qin, and then the Qing Dynasty, was what brought the mass of separate tribal identities of the Jurchens together, and molded it into one monolithic group identity. Personally, I favor the latter theory, as it seems to make the most sense to me. But even proponents of this theory will admit that Manchu identity was malleable. It was created to serve a political purpose, and while having actual Manchu blood was certainly an important aspect of Manchuness, there were sometimes ways of getting around this, in the name of political expediency. There were cases when Han bannermen were allowed to officially change their ethnicity to Manchu, seemingly supporting the notion that genetic heritage had little to do with Manchu identity. But these cases were rare. I mentioned in episode 1, introducing China, that in the 1760s and 70s, mounting economic issues caused the imperial court to decide to cut a large portion of the Han banner population out of the banners entirely, to reduce the cost of maintaining them. At this same time, the court was very concerned about the large numbers of Manchus who seemed to have abandoned the Manchu way. Yet, those Manchus were allowed to stay in the banners, while many of the Han who were kicked out were, by the admission of the Manchus themselves, better adherents to the Manchu way, as the court defined it, than many Manchus. They were indistinguishable from true Manchus, yet they were not true Manchus. Manchuness was near and dear to the emperor and other Manchus. If just anyone could become a Manchu, then what was it that justified their rule over the Chinese masses? Although the imperial court always insisted that Manchus and Han were equal, everyone knew this wasn't the case. In the end, it seems to me that what really defined Manchu identity was both their Jurchen heritage and their membership in the banners. Over time, the terms Manchu and Banner people became almost synonymous. Almost. But it was close enough that some time after the communist government came to power, they made a rule that anyone who could prove they had ancestors in the Banners could register in the censuses as ethnically Manchu, which many formerly Han people did. So, what about this idea of the Manchus assimilating? Is it true that they assimilated to the point of it being impossible to tell the difference between them and Han people? It was certainly a popular concept among Chinese nationalists of the 19th and 20th centuries. Holding this belief allowed them to stroke their own egos while still under Manchu rule. The Manchus may have conquered China, they reasoned, but it was really China who conquered them in the end. A nice idea for a Chinese nationalism, but it doesn't seem to have been the case. As I've been laboring to explain to you, Manchus had many privileges over other people, including other Banner people. To pass the imperial examination, they didn't have to go through the grueling essay writing process everyone else did. They took a test on writing and shooting, which was much easier to pass. They made up a massively disproportionate segment of the bureaucracy and of the upper class as a result. And of course, to the last days of the imperial system, emperors could only, marry Manchu or Mongol women, never a Han or anyone else, not even Han Banner women. There were cultural aspects they carried over from their heritage as well. Manchus never practiced foot binding as most Han did. Manchu women could, and indeed were expected to, play sports, and in a limited fashion, take part in social events. Although much of their clothing was borrowed from the Chinese, much of it was their own. Manchu women wore different hairstyles than Chinese women. Meanwhile, all the men in China, Manchu or not, were forced to wear the exact same hairstyle, a traditionally Manchu style in which the head was shaved bald in the front and around the edges of the scalp, leaving the middle to grow long, and then braiding it. Quite the opposite of Manchus adopting Chinese ways. In this case, it was the Manchus imposing a part of their own culture on the whole empire, though the fact that the hairstyle fell out of favor almost instantaneously when the Republic was declared shows it was not adopted by choice. Usually called a Q, the hairstyle received lots of derision from Westerners, including such unflattering nicknames as pigtail or monkey tail. It was a symbol of a man's obedience to the emperor, and any man found without a Q was automatically assumed to be a rebel, and was therefore subject to summary execution. To summarize, the 8 Banners formed a core of loyal supporters who made up a system of ethnic nepotism that ran parallel to, and in places overlapped with, China's traditional merit-based examination system. Banner people could work for the army, for the Banner administration, which was considered to be part of the army, or for the civil bureaucracy. And there were ways of transferring between the Banner administration and the bureaucracy. It was one of the key pillars of the Qing regime. Even when it became clear that Manchus were losing what, in the court size, made them Manchu, it was never suggested that the system might need to be overhauled. The court would do anything to keep the system alive, and this wasn't irrational. In the end, it's important to note that, for all its flaws, the system did what it was supposed to do. It united the Manchus, and kept them loyal. Although the Qing had their share of coups d'etat, and sometimes Mongol or Han bannermen rebelled, there is not one single instance, in Qing history, of a full-scale civil war that pitted Manchu against Manchu. It was always Manchus and their non-Manchu followers against rebellious Han, Muslims, Mongols, or others. Manchu armies never fought against each other, and it must be recognized that the system of monolithic identity emphasizing Manchu unity that was the 8 Banners played a major role in that. I've already touched on the Qing military twice, but I want to take some time to expand on that information so you can get a clearer idea of what the military engagements are going to look like going forward. There were, as you know, 2 segments to the professional military. the Banner Army, which was better equipped and supposedly better trained, and the Green Standard Army. In addition to these, local gentry often raised militias of their own to deal with bandits or act as their own personal brute squad in their local areas. In 1850, they were mainly armed with long spears, which might be better described as short pikes, and bows. Firearms were present whenever they were available, but they were mostly the hopelessly outdated matchlock muskets, which had been phased out of European armies around 150 years earlier. They were heavy, clunky, inaccurate, and short-ranged. One firearm they had lots of was cannons, though these were mostly only used in sieges until the 1860s. When soldiers closed to short range or were fighting in tight quarters, they resorted to their backup weapon, which was mainly the single-edged sword called in Mandarin the Dao, sometimes called the Chinese broadsword, although it's more like a type of saber. There were no uniforms as such, but there was a standard of equipment expected from soldiers. To distinguish themselves from imperialists, Taiping soldiers very early on took to wearing what are usually called red turbans, but were what we would better recognize as bandanas on their heads. I'm not sure how much armor was worn, but heavy cavalry and other elite troops would certainly have worn it, considering melee fighting was still a major part of warfare. But with muskets becoming more common, armor was losing its usefulness. All in all, a battlefield from the Taiping Rebellion would probably have looked, to European eyes, more like a battlefield from the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, rather than something from the mid-19th. Blocks of spearmen in close formation would have formed the backbone of the battle line, with archers and musketeers shooting at the opposing line. China has never really been known for its cavalry. The imperialists, with their Mongol and Manchu banner cavalry, usually held a distinct advantage in that area, able to scout, harass, or assault the enemy's flanks as needed. This advantage was often negated through the use of entrenchments. It also would have been a remarkably colorful battlefield, as every regiment had its own regimental flags, often uniquely designed and only used by that regiment, making the skyline above a Taiping or imperialist army a raucous blend of different colors and designs. South China in 1850 was a place that was ready for rebellion. Although few could have predicted the sheer amount of blood that was soon to be shed, someone who was familiar with the area should have been able to predict something big was brewing. Qing rule in the south was somewhat tenuous. There were ethnic groups who were not at all fond of the Qing and who had fought them tenaciously in the past. Banner garrisons were few and far between. Manchus, being from the frigid northeast, didn't like the subtropical climate of the south, and so left the garrison cities entirely to Han bannermen, who themselves were few in number compared to some of the garrisons in north and central China. The south was also a hotbed of activity for the Triad Society. In modern times, the Triads are like the Chinese mafia, highly organized and ruthless criminal organizations that have their fingers stuck in everything and have corrupt politicians in their pockets, so the police don't bother them too much. In the 1850s, the Triads were a collection of loosely affiliated rural secret societies, whose purpose was to overthrow the Qing Dynasty and re-establish the Ming. Secret societies have been a part of Chinese history for ages. They take many forms, everything from simple book-reading clubs to revolutionary movements. As the name suggests, they were secretive, and almost universally hated by governments for it. For some reason, governments, especially authoritarian ones, really don't like people meeting and plotting in secret. The origins of the Triads are somewhat obscure, as is their name. They probably took inspiration from, and may even have originated as a branch of, other secret societies, like the White Lotus and or the Heaven and Earth Society, both of which were anti-Qing societies in the 18th century. though the White Lotus had its roots in a movement that began to overthrow the Qing Dynasty. These types of societies often went dormant for decades, only to reappear in a slightly different form when something roused them. Sometimes they went by the same name, but more often local branches each had their own name, and outsiders, to avoid confusion, used the catch-all umbrella term for a broad group of societies with similar practices, but no overall leadership. Since they often took inspiration from one another, and in some cases may have had some of the same founders, different societies often shared many beliefs and practices. There's a temptation to draw a straight line of doctrinal continuity from the White Lotus to the Heaven and Earth, to the Triads, to the Boxers, to the Red Spears. Each was inspired in part by, and usually looked up to, their predecessor, though some were contemporaries. However, it's hard, if not impossible, to draw a direct line between them, since they met in secret and didn't leave records. The name Triad might be an English rendering of the Chinese name for them, San He Hoi, which means Triple Union Society, referring to heaven, earth, and humanity. It also might be a reference to the triangular symbols the societies liked to use. The Triads would meet in private homes, away from the eyes of the militia and the gentry, to plot and to train in martial arts to prepare themselves for the moment when they would strike. They had elaborate ceremonies for joining the society, including magic rituals and the swearing of oaths before the gods of the Chinese folk religion. There were also all kinds of secret signals and passwords used to recognize fellow society members. One method of communication was to bake written messages into pastries to easily be delivered in secret. I can't prove it, but I like to think that's how the Chinese got so good at making fortune cookies. Although the Triads were never anywhere near as big a player as the Taiping would become. Owing to their decentralized nature and lack of proper military discipline within their ranks, they were to become a force to be reckoned with. The God-worshippers' uprising was the perfect opportunity, and the Triads had no intention of squandering it. They will raise armies in the tens of thousands, wreaking havoc all over the south and as far north as the Yangtze, waging a guerrilla campaign of attrition. Besides the Triads, some White Lotus and Heaven and Earth holdouts were still active, though most of them had been wiped out in the crackdown after the White Lotus Rebellion of 1794 to 1804. Those are not all the factions that will be taking part in the next decade and a half of bloodshed, but the rest won't be coming into play until later. Join me next time. I think it's about time the God-worshipping society became Taiping Tianguo.